Okay. Okay, very briefly, I won't waste time on autobiography, but my name is Stephen Lysaght. I'm a docent at the Ruth Bancroft Garden since 2003, secretary of the San Francisco Succulent and Cactus Society, and I'm a complete amateur really when it comes to botanical information. So if I mispronounce Latin names, I apologize in advance. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them as we progress. This is a view from Tabletop Mountain outside Cape Town of aloe arborescens in habitat. Beautiful, spectacular blooms. If you've never been to Cape Town, it's one of the most beautiful cities in the world. And of course, you have great botanical expeditions launching from that locality. This is a map of South Africa, giving you a little bit of an idea of the habitats that we will be seeing. We started down here in southwestern South Africa, Cape Town, and we traveled all the way up to the Namibian border, traveling through what's called Namakwa land, named after the Nama people of South Africa. And then at the very end of the presentation, if we have time, hopefully, I'll take you to Kruger National Park up here in the northeastern part of South Africa to see a few of the animals. This shows the route of the expedition, which was with a company called Plant Expeditions, which is owned by Guillermo Rivera of Argentina. Picture of the South African flag. These are scenes from Cape Town. I couldn't resist putting a photo of Malva pudding in the slide presentation. It's the ubiquitous dessert of South Africa. Really good if you have never tried it. And this is how most of us get to the top of Table Mountain in Cape Town via funicular. Some people hike it, but it takes several hours. Your views looking down upon Cape Town from Table Mountain. And on top of Table Mountain, which is just native plants, we encountered a succulent, Crassula coccinea. Also on Table Mountain are many plants in what are called the fynbos. It's Afrikaans for fine-leafed plants and includes Proteaceae, including leucodendron. This was a Drosera, a carnivorous plant in a little boggy area. And I thrown in a lot of gratuitous pictures of lichens growing on boulders because the colors are really breathtaking. An unidentified beautiful flowering plant on Table Mountain. Many of these, unfortunately, none of us could ID, not succulents, obviously. Moss-covered trees. And then this is back in Cape Town, looking at what is called Lion's Head, just towering above the city. Backwards view of Cape Town. And then we went to the Cape of Good Hope, the southwesternmost point of South Africa, and encountered the first mesons, a Carpo brutus. I use the word mesons somewhat euphemistically to refer to all the plants in the Isoaceae, because formerly they were called Mesembryantheaceae. This is a view looking up the hillside just opposite the street from that meson at Euphorbia caput medusae, covering the hillside in huge in profusion. Here's a close-up of a plant that was right at the edge of the road, probably seeds had come down to the bottom of the hill and germinated. For those of you not familiar with euphorbias, euphorbias have explosive seed capsules. So when they ripen and the seed capsule opens up, the seeds are expelled in many directions. Euphorbia caput medusae, I also might add, is one of the more fragrant flowers in the Euphorbiaceae. Close-up of the flowers of caput medusae. They're not truly the white structures on the external part of the flower structure are not really flower petals. Euphorbias have a unique flower structure. And in that same locality, an maculate aloe, we weren't sure if it was maculata or gradidentata. Again, just growing right on the side of the freeway. And just some random shots of beautiful plants, not succulent, unfortunately, therefore not ID'd. Went to Boulders Beach, just south of Cape Town, where there is one of the only endemic penguin colonies. Beautiful habitat, close up of a mother and chick. And in that same area, encountered another plant in the Proteaceae, Leucospermum, sometimes called the pincushion flower. Nearby Euphorbia caput medusae, this time growing in sand just a few meters away from the water's edge at a beach. First, cotyledon orbiculata, which is an incredibly variable cotyledon. This one has interesting, beautiful red margins on the leaf tips, as you can see. More interesting lichens and mosses growing on the boulders there. This is the Ruchia flower in that same locality, Cape Point. Unfortunately, I don't know the species. Also in the Isoaceae. I thought a really beautiful lichen. A Felicia amyloides nearby, that same area. And also Chacma baboons at the Cape of Good Hope. They are one of the most ubiquitous monkeys that you see all throughout South Africa. That same area, a kudu, one of the larger antelopes in South Africa, and a female ostrich in that same area. We then went to Kirstenbosch National Botanic Garden, just outside Cape Town, and it's planted, I believe, exclusively with South African endemics. And here we're looking back at Table Mountain, and these are two Alomarlothii, and, an Alomarlothii and two Alloferox in bloom, or with dying blooms. Another view of the mountains in back of Kirstenbosch. In here, a field of euphorbia. Unfortunately, we weren't sure if it was Pentagona in Constantina. Flowers, it's often difficult to discern the difference. Phyllica pubescens with lovely fuzzy, lacy flowers and foliage. Another plant in the Proteaceae, an actual protea flower. Leucospermum in the Proteaceae, Phenbos. Protea flower, not before it's opened. In a backwards view from Kirstenbosch looking down toward Cape Town. In the foreground, finally a succulent, a cotyledon orbiculata, and you can see the difference in the structure of the foliage on this plant compared to the one we saw earlier. It's a Alu rupestris flower. And a view of the cycad garden in South Africa. Cycads are a very ancient family of plants going back to the era of the dinosaurs, and have very palm-like structure. So many people mistakenly think of them as palms. Kirstenbosch has one of the most extensive collections of cycads in South Africa. Here's a view of probably an Encephalartos in bloom with cone-like flowers. And here you can see the very ancient connection of the cycads to plants in the pine family. So they are related to conifers, and that's kind of demonstrated by the structure of the cone-like flower. Inside Kirstenbosch is a fabulous greenhouse. And in the center was planted an Adansonia digitata, the beautiful baobab of South Africa. There are actually two species of baobab on the continent of South Africa, but a greater diversity of that genus in Madagascar. I believe 6 species in Madagascar, and there's also a species in Australia. So that demonstrates a continuity of a family of plants across the southern hemisphere, going back to the era in which all the continents were merged together in the ancient Gondwana land, broke apart, and then the plants and animals evolved separately. It's my husband Gary standing next to a Cyphostemma carori for perspective. Euphorbia in the greenhouse, believe it was Barnardi. And in the foreground, Euphorbia grandicornis, undulating leaf margins and incredible spination. Euphorbia, one of the many varieties of Euphorbia horrida, now dubbed polygona, with horrida being the older name. Here's a group of many plants, aloes, senecios, cotyledons in the bed, and some Isoaceae. And also in the greenhouse is Pachypodium namaquanum. This is one of, I think, the most beautiful Pachypodiums in the family. It has probably the most long spines of any of the Pachypodiums, beautiful undulating leaf margins. And they all tend, as they evolve, to grow in one direction, leaning northward. And the story of that legend is from the Nama people. They were one of the main indigenous ethnic groups in South Africa and Namibia when the Europeans and other African ethnic groups migrated south into South Africa. The story is that the Germans in particular waged war on the Nama people, who were mostly hunter-gatherers and pastoralists. Of course, the Nama people lost in those battles, and they were driven south out of Namibia into South Africa across the Orange River. And their legend is that their ancestors, as they gazed longingly back northward into Namibia, their homeland, across the river, eventually became the Pachypodium namaquanum. An Aloedendron dichotomum in the greenhouse, formerly Aloe dichotoma. I believe this was a hemathis in bloom. And an interior shot of a garden bed filled with welwitschia, which are not technically succulents, but many of us succulent collectors really love the welwitschia. Very ancient family of plants that just grows 2 leaves. So all these curling structures are just a very ancient leaf as it dries out. And growing in the Namibian desert. It's a very xerophytic or low water needing. A Hoodia, Gordonia, I believe. Let me see, I'm having a hard time seeing the lower part of my screen, I'm sorry. Hoodias are Asclepiads, related to Quernias and Staphylias, with the same structured flower that usually is kind of stinky to our nose because they attract flies as pollinators. The fly lays its eggs on the plant thinking it's going to be future meal for its larvae, and of course then they die off, but in the meantime the fly has usually pollinated the flowers. Also, they had some beautiful bonsais at the Kirstenbosch Botanic Garden of endemic trees. A ficus, an acacia. And as we drove out of Cape Town into the field to do further botanical exploration, just encountered the first of what turned out to be an incredible diversity of crickets and beetles therein. I find them just interesting aesthetically. A baboon skull out in the field. Some oxalis growing in a rock crevice. And then finally, the first Conophytum obcordellum on the field trip. Conophytums are also in the Isoaceae. South Africa has this incredible diversity of them. And I discovered recently that from a CSSA presentation that these are the genus of plants that are most commonly poached in South Africa because so many of them are very rare and people all over the world want them, sadly. It's an interesting little bulb with spiraling leaves. You saw that recurringly in South Africa, these spiraling leaves. And then Campsurus retusa, very succulent, interesting little fibers growing out of some of the rosettes. A Lachenalia carnosa. I know most people don't think of bulbs as being succulents, but when you think about it, they are very succulent, with their bulbs storing moisture subterranean, and beautiful flowers. A lot of interesting bulbs in bloom that field trip. Oh, by the way, this was The trip was in mid-August toward early September of 2019. Pretty little purple flower unidentified. Another Ruchia in bloom in the Isoaceae. And then Tylocoton reticulatus. Tylocotyns formerly were lumped in with cotyledons, but they are distinctly different genus. They are usually winter growers, for instance, shed their foliage during our dry summers. This particular species retains its old flower inflorescences or forming peduncles sometimes. In a Quaqua mammillaris, also an asclepiad with seed pods. A new euphorbia, medusoid euphorbia, tuberculata. If I use the word medusoid, by the way, it comes from the appearance of the plant, that it has all these radiating branches from a central head, kind of mimicking the snakes for hair of the mythical female figure Medusa. Another species of Tylocoton, paniculatus, in the Cedarburg Wilderness area. Beautiful fat trunks with peeling bark. Shrubby Euphorbia mauritanica. And then we stayed in the town of Van Riensdorp. This was a hoodia growing in the garden next door to the little B&B in which we stayed, in full bloom. I was so envious to think of having a garden in which you can grow hoodias in the open. We went to a nursery in Van Riensdorp and saw some of the trees and plants that could be purchased if you lived in South Africa. This Aloedendron dichotomon was massive, and it was ready to be transported somewhere. Just random shots inside the nursery. Beautiful Aloe pearsoni. Beautiful red color. Kumara plicatilis, formerly Aloe plicatilis, also ready to be shipped off to its purchaser. It's very envious. Some buophony, a beautiful endemic bulb to South Africa. The Dioscorea for sale at the nursery. A massive caudix, as you can see. And interestingly planted, these aloe, I believe they were falcatas, in these wire barrel-like structures just filled with rocks, and the aloes seem to be pretty happy therein. In front of the nursery, an Aloedendron dichotomon with beautiful peeling bark, as you can see. If you're still using the word aloe, that's personally, I don't like the splitting of all these plant families, but aloe was split into several groups recently, with the more tree-like aloes now being called Aloedendron. It's a beautiful Aloe herreriensis in that garden with the incredible color from the South African sun. And across the street, these ancient Aloedendron dichotomons, just so breathtaking. Back in the field, we found another interesting bulb, Trachyandra tortilis or flexifolia. Again, demonstrating that interesting undulating leaves that many of the South African bulbs have evolved. Pretty cool lichens growing on dead wood. And a new conophytum species, Pegiae. You can see the interesting little fissures on the top of the leaf from which the flower would emerge, and eventually the plant split and formed two new leaves from the center. Here's a close-up of an Argyroderma thalatii, also in the Isoaceae. New succulent genus that encountered, Othona protecta. Othonas are like senecius, kind of succulent daisies with daisy-like flowers when they bloom. A new euphorbia species, Hamata, covered with flowers. Crassula cornuta, beautiful stacked leaves. Crassula columnaris in bloom, surrounded by a plant in the Isoaceae. If you notice, the leaves of this mesem have almost like crystal-like surfaces on them. And so when Europeans saw these plants for the first time, and others we will see, They thought they're coated with something like ice crystals, from whence comes the name ice plant. They're actually just little water vesicles storing water. There's another Othona in bloom. Again, those pretty daisy-like flowers. And here's the plant that I think most clearly demonstrates the ice plant concept, Mesembryanthemum crystallinatum, probably named for the kind of crystal-like structures, water-storing structures on the surface of the leaves. It's a pretty little flower in bloom. An Argyroderma physsum, also in the Isoaceae, with a little pollinator in the center. And Pelargonium crythmifolium. Many of the plants in the Pelargonium genus in South Africa are very succulent, forming big, fat, thick stems. Pretty little, beautiful flowers. It's a close-up of the flowers. And looking out at a hillside covered with Cephalophyllum, again, a plant in Isoaceae. Close-up of the Cephalophyllum. Looks a lot like what we call ice plants coating the California coast, doesn't it? Another example of Tylocoden reticulatus, with those interesting dried flower inflorescences being retained. Crassula, I believe, in Namaquensis, sending out a beautiful little bloom. Beautiful fuzzy leaves on that one. A new Tylocoden species, Waliki, we encountered. And here, this particular species demonstrates the retention of the what are called peduncles, or the remnants of the end of the inflorescence, these little knobby growth, what appeared to be growths on the branches of the plant. Another cute little spiraling bulb, Albucus spiralis. Another beautiful bulb, Ornithoglossum vulgare. Just thought that flower was so compelling. It's more lichens and quartz. Another example of cotyledon orbiculata with an unusual, not unusual, but a different leaf structure than those we already saw. I think one of the most variable leaves in the amongst succulent plants. Another species of Anacampsaris basecki, covered with fine little filaments in a rock crevice. And Alarilichia cactiformis. This was probably one of the biggest, most exciting things for us to find incidentally. And we only saw the one specimen in this whole mountaintop, but it was in bloom for us. Sclepiad group of plants. Pretty little bulb flower emerging from the sand. This is a view of a beautiful kind of caudiciform tree. It might have been an acacia. Monsonia, which was formerly called Sarcocollis grassicolis, also related to Pelargonium. So here you can see the nice succulent qualities of this plant, even though we don't normally think of plants in these families as being succulent. Lovely purple lavender flower on a bulb. And finally, a field of Allodendron dichotomum in habitat, formerly Allodichotoma. And for those of you who like aloes, this is a kind of, a bucket list experience to be able to see these fabulous plants growing in habitat. And a massive, massive trunk on one of them with multiple branches. At first glance, I thought this was Allodendron ramosissimum because of the profusion of the branches, but normally, and they may be, I think they're very closely related, but dichotomum normally branches higher up on the trunk. Ramosissima often branches right at the base, and I'm sitting in front of the tree just to give it perspective. Oh, this is a really interesting plant, animal called a hyrax, or Dacian africans. They're this incredibly endearing, cute, rodent-like plant animals from outward appearances, but they're actually a mammal whose most closest relative is the elephant. And no similarity other than they actually do grow two prominent fang-like teeth, which are not discernible in this photo. This is in Springbok. This is a field a field in front of the hotel in which we stayed, Conicosia elongata, a beautiful plant in the Isoaceae in bloom. Really lovely bulb emerging in that same field, Trachyandra falcata. And I learned later that the flowers are often harvested and eaten. Euphorbia mauritanica growing in that field in bloom. Close-up of the Euphorbia mauritanica with a cute little beetle probably pollinating the flowers. And this is Hoodia gordoni in the field, out in the desert, literally the desert, covered with dried out inflorescences. This area of South Africa is called Namakwaland, named after the Nama people that I mentioned earlier. A comifera, which may not technically be a succulent, but I think many of us who like succulent plants and caduciforms are interested in plants like this, the comifera, and in the New World bursera, because they develop big, fat, swollen trunks storing water to survive drought. It's another one that's very prostrate, growing along the surface of the desert floor. And Euphorbia virosa in that same locality, growing in profusion, these huge, massive clumps, just spectacular, I thought, against the browns of the background. Virosa, I think it's got the species name Virosa because its sap is one of the most poisonous in the Euphorbiaceae. So be careful if you got that one in your garden or in your nursery. Serraria namaquensis, one of my favorite succulent plants ever. It's just got the cutest, tiniest little succulent leaves on the branches. New Euphorbia lignosa in that same locality. No leaves or flowers, interesting structure to the branches, I think. Oh, this is to give perspective of the locality where we're finding where many of these plants. That's my husband Gary in the foreground. And in that same field in which we're walking, we encountered this Euphorbia, Friedrichiae, just so beautiful with nothing else in the sand, just these Euphorbias growing in that field virtually. And there's a tiny little flower at the base of this plant. Oops, sorry. Here's a close-up of the flower of Friedrichiae. And another interesting beetle in that area. We weren't sure what this was, unfortunately. By the way, I've consulted 2 experts on trying to ID many of these plants, and unfortunately, amongst us all, we weren't able to identify all the plants I'm showing, but we believe this is a senecio, another succulent daisy. And our first lithops in the field. For those of you who like lithops, I know when I first started collecting them, I started to consider them annuals because I killed them every year. But here they are growing in habitat in the ground. And as you can see, they're doing what many of these plants in Isoaceae do. You just see the surface of the leaf emerging from the sand and the quartz in the soil there. And these surfaces then, of course, can photosynthesize, whereas the rest of the plant is protected from the sun and the heat below ground. These are dried seed capsules. And what happens with plants in the Isoaceae, when they form a seed capsule of this nature, if it rains or they receive a little moisture, the seed capsule opens up with a kind of 5-starred structure and expels the seeds, hoping presumably that they will germinate with the moisture. So Euphorbia dreggiana in that locality. Cephalophyllum, another plant in Isoaceae in bloom. Chirodopsis denticulata, another mesem. Cephalophyllum. Chirodopsis harrier, or could be Plansy. Another Monsonia, this one in full leaf and bloom. Different species of lithops. This particular plant is growing underneath the shade of a nurse plant, as many of them do. So they're protected from the full sun and heat in the environment. Beautiful Chirodopsis palanzi with just thought the lavender-like color of the leaves is really pretty with the green new leaves emerging. The Tylochodon reticulatus, massive clump of a plant with many of the inflorescences retained. Cute little Crassula columnaris in bloom, emerging out of the sand in that area. Above, a Crassula corallina, tight little compact leaves, as you can see, in a quartz field, and in front, another bulb, either spiraling leaf bulb, Gathilus or albuca. The leaves on these plants are really succulent compared to many bulbs. And here a Mesembryanthemum encountered for the first time. This one doesn't demonstrate the feature particularly, but Mesembryanthemum often have these little what appear ice crystal-like structures on the surface of the leaves, which are water storage capsules, and gave rise to the name ice plants. There's a Chirodopsis denticulata also in bloom. Then a new locality on this hilltop, we encountered these incredible aloes, Aloe garriopensis, dried inflorescences. And I think this particular plant demonstrates why I usually don't remove the old dead leaves on some of my aloe species. It depends on the species, of course, but I think the dried up leaves, you know, are kind of interesting structurally and probably protect the trunk of the plant. Less mature Aloe garriopensis, but with beautiful color. A Quokka mammillaris in Springbok area, also an Asclepiad. Different Laconalia carnosa, pretty speckled leaves. A Drosanthemum, I think it was Hispidum in bloom. Another plant, Nizoaceae. A new species of beetle. Looked kind of otherworldly. An Antimema, might be a Ruchia, sorry about the IDs here. And another Cotyledon orbiculata, yet again with a slightly different leaf structure from those we've seen. Conophytum bilobum, beautiful color on the leaf margins, I thought. And the first Adromiscus that we encountered, Alstoni. Many of these plants, by the way, are growing in little niches and crevices in pure rock. So presumably the seeds can get there and germinate because it's might retain a little water for them. Big fat Tylochodon paniculatus on this hillside. Took a while to hike up to that one. And in that same area, Aloe melanacantha. Beautiful black spines on these plants, as you can see in this photo. Not spines, I should say teeth. The Tylochodon waliki with old dried inflorescences still retained on a hillside. Crassula corallina in Namaqua, cute little compact rosettes. Crassula deceptor, really pretty, I thought, epidermis. Chirodopsis palanzia again in flower. Sorry for the redundancy in some of these photos. Another Conophytum pegiae, nice tight compact group of plants. Crassa nudicalis, not sure if it's variety Harrier or even brevifolia. Unless they're in bloom, sometimes it's hard for us to tell the difference. As you can see, just emerging from a rock crevice. And this is one of my favorite succulent plants, Ophonia euphorbioides, so named presumably because the spination reminded somebody of a euphorbia. They form nice big fat trunks and codexes, beautiful foliage and flowers, and the spines. This one is in full leaf, as you can see. It's another Adromiscus alstoni. Here's a massive Ophonia euphorbioides. Again, kind of a succulent daisy. Avonia papyraceae, first Avonia we saw, they're related to the Anacampsaris. In a rock crevice, a Conophytum bilobum emerging, big clump of it. In the same rock crevice nearby, an Adromiscus nanus. So all those little leaves are all Adromiscus. Crassula tomentosa, so named because of the little fuzzy leaves that it has. Pretty lichen growing on quartz. Emerging from under this quartz rock is another bulb of Brunsvigia namaquana, Interesting little filaments on the leaf surface. An osteospermum, it's either amplectins or hyosauroides in that area. Pretty little bulb. You can see the spiraling leaves below the flower. I thought it was pretty. It's a Morea serpentina. An unidentified mesem, pretty pink flowers. And a Kleinia longiflora. Kleinias are also, they're related to Senecios and Othonas, a succulent daisy plant, kind of a succulent daisy. At first glance, we all thought it was euphorbia. And yet again, a kind of interesting prehistoric looking beetle. On this very stark hillside, little rock niches, you found Crassula nudicalis, incredible flower, leaf color. And the first and only tortoise we encountered out in the field. Sorry for the fuzzy nature of the photo, but he was moving. He was trying to get away from us. Massive clump of Orvia namaquensis with a little crassula in the lower left corner. Here's the Orvia with seed capsules. And the close-up of the flower, the Orvia namaquensis. Again, it's in the Sclepiad family. So quite often the flowers in these genuses emit a kind of foul-smelling odor to us to mimic feces or decaying animal flesh to attract flies to pollinate them. There's another female ostrich in the area. And then a Gathilus grandiflora. As I just thought this was one of the more interesting bulbs we encountered, with this almost encasement at the base of the foliage to protect the base of the leaves. Gorteria diffusa. Another specimen of Crassula deceptor. You can see this particular plant is not quite as sunburnished as the earlier one we saw, and a little more profuse in its branching. A Crassula muscosa, really cool little stacked leaves. An oxalis flower, probably obtusa. And then on this hillside, we found Aloe glauca. Huge ancient clump of plants there. It's a close-up of some very young plants. And a much older plant that's been colored up and withered a bit by the sun. New Tylocoden species, racemosus. And an interesting little Senecio radicans. You don't see much emerging from the soil except those leaves. Crassula montana, subspecies quadrangularis. And these rosettes really tight and compact, and again growing in little rock crevices. Here it is, as you can see, growing in quartz. Another Crassula cotyledonous. Beautiful lavender leaves. Crassula hirtipes. Again, I apologize for mispronouncing a lot of the Latin here. An unidentified conophytum in that area. Another Orvia namaquensis flower. And unfortunately, we weren't able to identify this plant Nizoaceae, but it really shows the crystal-like ice little structures dotting the leaves. Orthoda capensis in flower. Another Gathilus grandiflora. Sorry, I'm just really drawn to these spiraling leaves. This is a Tromotriche aperta, another plant in the Sclepiad family. Close-up of the flower of the Tromotriche. And you see the 5-petaled leaves. Crassula in flower, and I'm sorry, none of us were able to ID the species on this one. And this was the first and only Haworthia we encountered in this on this trip, Haworthia baldusi. But it's really beautiful. And this one had a flower emerging. There's a group of three plants or so just kind of sucking themselves up into the soil of this rock surface. Here we have both Euphorbius moratenica and hamata in the same locality. Lichens. And then we checked into this fabulous guest house in a town called Kleinsee. I couldn't resist taking a picture of this aloe. The color was just so magnetic. Out in the field in that locality, we encountered another conophytum in bloom. Unfortunately, again, I'm sorry, I couldn't ID it. Euphorbia ramiglans. This was on a beach very close to the water's edge, and thought this one was interesting with the caterpillar possibly inadvertently pollinating the flowers as it ate them. An unidentified plant, I think it's an Isoaceae growing in the sand there near the beach. And here's what appears to be mesons, but sadly nobody on the trip could ID most of these plants. A huge massive clump of common ophytums, and these are all again growing in the beach, as you can see with the shells nearby. Pretty little beetle on a meson flower. This is a really lovely senecio. We couldn't ID the species, but the translucence of the leaves was lovely, I thought. Massive clump of conos with some other plants and Isoaceae, senecios, right on the beach. This is a Brownanthus kunze, which none of us I could ID at the time. It is actually in the Isoaceae, and I just thought it had such interesting structure and color. Huge clump of conos in a rock crevice. Thought this crassula and these adras cascading down these rock surfaces was really lovely. Tiny little heads on this cono. Grouping of crassula and Isoaceae here. Crassula deceptor in Kleinsee. We've seen two other specimens of this plant, but this one must be really ancient, as you can see from the length of the stems with the dried leaves. Lovely senecio. And then we went to a new locality and found Aloe bramesii with spectacular color against these brown boulders. There's one, the earlier photo, you can see the leaves haven't yet spiraled, but in this older plant they have. Lovely flowers. And here's a couple of specimens that, were in a slightly different part of the mountain, probably protected from some of the sunlight. Receive more irrigation for a variety of reasons, depending on where they germinated, the seeds germinated. Lovely conophytum where most of the plants don't even demonstrate the little fissure very clearly from whence the flowers would emerge. Cute little fuzzy leaf crassula growing in a rock crevice. Crassula brevifolia again. The Crassula tomentosa in bloom. And then in that same locality, we found Aloe crepoliana for the first time, a really cool little aloe, sometimes difficult to discern in the field here, surrounded by other plants. This is I really like this Mesembryanthemum, really showing off the ice crystal-like structure of the leaves. It's water storing capsules. Euphorbia ramiglans, much of which is covered with sand growing there on the beach, but in full bloom. And in this case, this particular specimen was surrounded by snail shells, so highlighted. Another fascinating beetle. And we went to a town called Port Noleth on the coast as a base. I just thought some of the folk art in the town was kind of interesting. Indulge me here. Particularly like this octopus on top of the tank saying danger. And a local salon that I just thought it was really beautiful. All these different hairstyles that the women do. I tell you, the South African women have the most incredible sense of style. Love really gorgeous hairstyles. And this is just a walk through the neighborhood of that town, right on the coast. With a lot of succulents, as you can see, being used for landscaping, including natives and plants from the Americas. Another garden of Crassula floor. I didn't find habitat, but it was so beautiful. Had to pick a pick. Cool mosses and lichens growing out in the field on dead wood. An interesting little crass Isoaceae plant. Don't know the species or genus. And another on a hillside, a dormant pelargonium just starting to leaf out. You can see like caduciforms, like pelargoniums often. Nice big fat trunks and branches. And Tylocodon schaeferianus, very fragile plant. I have it in my collection. Every time I breathe on it, branches break off. There's Euphorbia lignosa growing out of the side of a rock face in flower. Close-up of some of the seed capsules of that plant. This is the Lysaght, also called trichocolum, in the Asclepiad group of family plants. It's another cool beetle on a flower. And then we found an Allodendron palanzi, formerly Allopalanzi. From at first glance, it looks a little bit like Allodendron dichotomum, but it tends to have thicker, fatter leaves that are not necessarily quite as elongated as dichotomum. And there's almost nothing else growing on this mountain except for the Allodendron palanzis. And there I am standing next to one to give it scale. Nearby, we found an Allodendron ramosismum. And here you can see the why they are subgrouped, not considered dichotomum necessarily, because they tend to branch lower on the stem. Close-up of the branch of the ramosismum against the sky. And in that same area, Allocarispergensis, which has got, I think, the most incredible striation and colors of its leaves. It's related to Allostriata. In the former picture, you see one in full sun, and then here, one that's in a rock, right against a rock face, so it's got more protection, perhaps receives more irrigation from the runoff of rainwater. Really massive Allodendron palanzi there. Lysaght, formerly called trichocolum. Stapelius similis. Then a close-up of its flowers, Stapelius similis. Massive Allodendron ramosissimum growing out of this clump of rocks. This looks like there was no soil there. Another Cotyledon orbiculata. It's a particular variety, Oophylla, really beautiful rounded leaves. More Allogariopensis with seed capsules along the inflorescence. Close up of the pretty color and striation in the leaves of that species. Another Euphorbia hamata, but growing purely in sand. Close up of a hamata seed pod. An identified stapeliad. The Brunanthus kunze, Isoaceae. This is another specimen of Schaeferianus. Compared to the earlier one we saw, where very few leaves and they were super red. This one is got very different color to the leaves and they're more profuse. Crassula we couldn't identify, but I just love the color of those inflorescence stems. Euphorbia dragiana. Crassula columnaris, really tight, compact leaf structure. And a new Senecio-species, sarcoides. Again, this is considered a in the daisy family, succulent daisies. This slope, this is the first and only gasteria that we encountered, palanzi, growing all over that rock face, as you can see. And then below it is these are the gasterias, and below it is a Tylocodon buchholzianus. Close up of the gasteria and of the Tylocodon. And this is the first time we encountered this plant, Hydnora africana. It's actually a parasite that grows on euphorbia roots, so you don't normally see it until it sends out its flower above the surface of the soil, but just compellingly interesting plants. Chirodopsis peculiaris. Love the color of the epidermis on these plants too in this field. Here are some that are really lovely pinkish lavender color. An unidentified bulb with interesting prostrate leaves and a pretty flower emerging. Crapoliana, Allocrapoliana in flower. Weren't sure whether this was a senecio, but it gives the appearance of being a succulent senecio. The new euphorbia in that same area, fasciculata. Lovely peduncles retained all along the stems, as you can see. Unidentified euphorbia there. I'm really compelled to find out what it is. So if anybody knows and could tell me afterwards, I appreciate it. Nobody on the trip or none of the experts I've consulted have been able to ID it. It reminds me a lot of a Madagascan euphorbia, but obviously it's not. Oh, and then we went to Namakwa National Park. This is the area that many people go to just to see the daisy-like flowers in bloom in the fields. Wasn't they weren't quite as profuse on our visit, but many people go to South Africa just to see these fields of color. Sorry for not being able to ID most of these plants. I like this. This is this huge, massive, can't make it out, a clump of caterpillars, like they're swarming all over each other. I don't know if they just emerged from egg sacs or there's some other purpose to them being in that little colony. Pretty little flower and bloom in the desert there. More fields of color in the Namakwa. I believe this was a crassula. Interestingly, none of us can ID it. This is a little more wildlife going on. These southern masked weaver birds were very interesting. They weave their nests and anchored them to the trees of the branches of this tree. New euphorbia in the field, Schoenlandi. Close-up of Schoenlandi's seed capsules. And then we went to a little town called Redendal, and this was an allodendron dichotomum growing in the garden right there at the hotel. Out in the desert, we went to the Karoo Desert National Botanical Garden, again planted just with endemics to South Africa. This is the flowers of an erythrina. Close-up of some flowers of a euphorbia. Unfortunately, wasn't sure what species it was. Fields of flowers there in the Karoo. And a cool little Cape Gray mongoose that was running around the botanical garden. Aloe speciosa in bloom. Some cycads in the botanical garden. It's a close-up of speciosa's flowers. Allodendron dichotomum growing there amongst other plants in the garden. Euphorbia mauritanica in front. And another Hydnora africana. These are the parasitic plants that we saw earlier that are feed off the roots of euphorbias. Gary sitting in front of a massive euphorbia ingens and covered with inflorescences, as you can see. Euphorbia enapla. Euphorbia polygona, sometimes called by many of us still horda. Alloclaviflora in bloom. Crassula rupestris growing on a hillside, or rock face rather. And Pachypodium namaquanum in the garden. Close-up of the namaquanum's flowers. This is Aloe van Baleni in the garden. Caterpillar on one of the leaves of the van Baleni. field of Cyphostemas. Cyphostemas are in the Vitaceae, related to grapes. And like grapes, their fruit are very toxic. Here I am crouching below a specimen just to give it perspective. Yeah, sense of the area there in the garden. We didn't see any out in the field. And then we drove to what's called the Cape Winelands district and did some field exploration to see one species of aloe that is probably in everybody's collection or garden. This is a plant, the fynbos, a leucodendron, leucospermum on that same hillside. And then, oh, I haven't found it yet. There's another Crassula coccinea, which we saw on Table Mountain. Pretty little xerophytic fern growing out of a rock face. Oxalis monophylla growing on the side of the road. Another carnivorous plant, a Drosera, growing in a little boggy area alongside the road. Close up of a lovely protea flower in the fynbos. And on this hillside, finally, we found Aloe plicatilus, now called Kumara, one of my favorite aloes. But what was interesting that we observed consistently is that the plicatilus there in habitat, as you can see, grow very unlike most of the ones that you'll encounter in a garden, at least in California, which our plants are often very low-lying and squat, big fat trunks. But most of the plants on this hillside in habitat, as you can see, had long trunks, narrow branches. They didn't become quite as caudiciform as ours do and grow very tree-like in habitat. Looking up the face of the hillside with a plicatilus in bloom. And in that same locality, Aloe mitriformis. So we're driving to Kruger. We stopped to look at this wonderful field of Aloe marlothi in habitat. And here's a close-up of a plant. This is a Kigelia africana, sometimes called the sausage tree because the seed pods are huge, massive sausage-shaped structures. And we're done with most of the botanical part. I'll wrap it up quickly with this little, if you'll indulge me with this little tour of Kruger National Park, which is in the north eastern part of the country. It's one of the largest national parks in Africa. It actually goes over its borders into 2 other countries, but at the entranceway was a Euphorbia cooperi in bloom. Here's a close-up of seed capsules of cooperi, really beautiful, I thought. And I hope most of you don't find this too gruesome, but when we stopped on the bridge leading into the park to gaze at the lovely river below us, we noticed that there was a dead hippo just below us being fed on by crocodiles. A little slice of life. Another crocodile in that river. And then inside the park, we stayed at a couple of different places, but in the landscaping of the park there is the Dinium multiflorum. Beautiful, beautiful flowers, I thought. Close-up of the flowers, multiflorum. And inside the park, we encountered the one and only specimen that we encountered on this trip of Adansonia digitata, other than the ones that were grown in the botanical garden, Kirstenbosch. But this specimen, unfortunately, we couldn't get out of our vehicle to get closer to this beautiful tree because we're within the confines of a park, and there are lions and all kinds of cheetahs and all kinds of leopards, all kinds of interesting predators all around. So you can't get outside your vehicle when you're doing these little safaris. Again, hope this isn't too gruesome for some of you, but I thought it was interesting to see these skulls at the little safari lodge we stayed. Elephant, a rhino, and a Cape buffalo. Saw lots of elephants, of course, and this is sometimes just, 10, 15 feet away from your vehicle. Gray heron in the park. The rhinos were just laying literally on the side of the road for our benefit. Beautiful animals. I just read recently, tragically, that some of the ranges within even Kruger get bought off by the poachers, and so the rhinos are still in danger in spite of all the protections for their benefit. Pack of lions just decided as we were coming upon them, lay down on the road and relax in the sun. Saw the traffic stopped in both directions for quite some time, but I don't think any of us were disappointed. Such beautiful creatures. We were told that animals like the lions view the vehicle as one entity. So they don't apparently identify the human beings that they can see in the vehicle as necessarily as prey. But if you were to get out of the vehicle, then they see you individually and possibly as prey. Lovely Burkell's cuckoo, photographed at night. Hyena. Hyenas are very interesting in many respects. There's a Cape water buffalo. Lovely Cape glossy starling. Another Chakma baboon. This was a male who was sitting on a bench in this area, and down below him was his troop of females and young. I think he was standing guard watching to make sure they were protected from us. A vervet monkey. Close up of his cute little face. A red-billed oxpecker on this buffalo. They tolerate the birds, of course, because they're eating the little insects that annoy them, especially around their eyes. View of a lake with hippos in it. The hippos tracking through the forest to get to the lake. Wildebeest drinking at the edge of the lake. Guinea fowl. A kudu. Beautiful markings on it, I thought. Giraffe. A warthog right next to our little bungalow. Rock monitor on the grounds of the safari hotel. A hoopoe, really beautiful birds. Saddle-billed stork. Lilac-breasted roller. This is, if not the national bird of South Africa, it's just a much beloved bird, but different colors in its feathers are, I thought, very pretty. It's another view of a roller. Again, hopefully nobody's sensibilities are offended by this image, but one day on our safari, as we were driving around, our trackers heard that there was a leopard killed nearby. So we drove to it, and we found this young female leopard. She was eating an impala, and just a few feet away from her was this Cape wild dog, just a few feet away. The wild dog kept trying to snatch the impala away from the leopard, but she would roar and try to attack the wild dog to drive it off. What we subsequently found out was actually that impala had been killed by a pack of these wild dogs, and the leopard, seized their prey. So the rest of the pack had run off, and this lone dog stayed behind to try and protect their catch. The next day, when we went back to the location, the leopard was asleep up in the tree, and she'd taken the impala up into the tree, as you can see, to keep it away from the dogs. She's really beautiful. Zebra. Steenbok. Red-crested korhan. Yellow-billed hornbills. This is a group of 2 different species of vulture. Impala. Cheetah. It's really exciting to see cheetahs for us. This is a termite mound, actually. A skink. And these are the grounds of the one of the safari hotels at which we stayed, and they had landscaped it with some baobabs. This structure here is called a boma. Well, it's after what's called a boma. The people live out in the pastoralists, live out in the wilderness. They create these structures called bomas to protect their livestock from attack and themselves, and they keep the livestock in a circle of branches and trees and spiny plants. And so this dining area was fashioned after that traditional structure. A chameleon that we encountered. And now I just have some pictures of some of the beautiful arts and crafts of South Africa, some of the fabrics that they make, metal sculptures of warthogs here, and then folk art in one of the shops. Some incredible masks that are available for purchase. This is just a painting in the little hotel at which we stayed of Aloedendron dichotomum. Beautiful beadwork done by some of the tribal peoples, as you can see. My favorite masks. Incredible inlay work with beads and cowrie shells. More beadwork. Malachite carvings. Another metal sculpture of an aardvark. Crystals and gemstones are really fabulous in South Africa. A quilt. And this was a t-shirt that I did actually purchase for my one of my souvenirs, because I was kind of cute, Rasta lion. And finally, just a little South African humor. This was a sign at the lodge at which we stayed, which I think kind of says it all about South African sense of humor. I'll give you a moment to read it. Anyway, I want to thank everybody for your attention. Hopefully I wasn't too redundant, didn't mispronounce too many words, didn't bore you. But I also want to thank our guide, Guillermo Rivera, and Brian Kimball, my trainer, actually taught me a lot of information as I went through docent training for the Ruth Bancroft Garden, which I'm a docent. So again, if you have questions, I'd be happy to entertain them. Let's see how I get to that part of the program. Stop share. Okay. Anyway, are there any questions or? Uh-oh, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, I've got a question.
Okay, yes, sir.
Well, that's a comment too. I mean, there's really nice
Yes,
pictures. You've had some fabulous plants there. I was really impressed by some of the stuff you got to see up north. So questions I had is, what time of year did you go and how long was your trip?
We were there for, we left in mid-August, and we were in Namaqualand, the Cape, Namaqualand up to the Namibian border for approximately 2 weeks. And then we did a tag-on tour a week in Kruger, which is optional. Not all the participants in the botanical tour did that extension. But if you do it, definitely go to Kruger, as you can see.
Well, we did Kruger on our first trip.
Oh, good for you.
That was before we knew much about plants. We never made it to the plants later. We would like to go back and see it again, but you know, that Kruger, of course, is just a classic.
Yeah.
Now we're going for little plants like you did.
Oh, I'm lucky that you saw that. It's a once in a lifetime experience. You know, I'm not suggesting that there are no other options, but Guillermo Rivera of Plant Expeditions is a fabulous guide. For those of you who don't know him, I've also done a trip with him to Madagascar and just this year to Baja California. So he's a fun guide, really.
Yeah, I don't want to say anything against Guillermo, because I see the results are great, but we've always gone on our own and had a great time, which gives you, you may not see, everything, you may not have access everywhere, but you do have more flexibility and it's really exciting when you find something on your own. But I have to say, we didn't see all the plants you saw. So you saw some really cool stuff.
Yeah, well, the other thing about using a guide, and not necessarily Guillermo, but they often will have GPS coordinates to know exactly where to go to see certain plants that you otherwise wouldn't know about. So there's that advantage to having a guide.
Plus, they may have the access to get you through closed gates on part of the property that we don't have.
Yeah, that's certainly true. And in Madagascar, actually, you can rent a vehicle, but you really would need a guide to go to the different localities to see plants in Madagascar. South Africa is pretty easy to navigate for most people, true. Any other questions or comments, feedback? You guys, I'm sorry, yes?
I was just comment on South Africa to what Naomi said, Naomi Bloss, like every 10 kilometers you just go, you stop, you find something. Madagascar may not be that easy, but I mean, there's so much stuff. Even if you miss half the stuff in South Africa, the half you see is still fabulous.
That is so true. You're right. I agree.
I just wanted to second Jan's comment. That was some amazing photography. So thank you for sharing that.
Wow, thank you. I appreciate those kind words. They were all taken with my little iPhone, pretty much.
Seriously?
Oh yeah,
wow.
I do use I do have a slightly fancier camera, but I only use it for the wildlife photography by and large. You know, you can get up close to the plants with a phone camera, and so many of them have fairly decent quality. But yeah, to capture shots of those birds, for instance, I had to use something with a stronger zoom lens. The plant photography, almost always just the iPhone. Any other questions or comments? Anybody able to ID something I wasn't able to ID? If you find out, think about it afterwards, let me know. I appreciate it. Well, if there are no other questions, thank you so much for letting me share this with you, and I hope it was enjoyable.
Thank you.
Okay, have a great Sunday afternoon. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My pleasure, truly.
All right.